All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into Proxmox. Specifically, we're looking at how to get the best performance out of ZFS,
Yeah.
especially when you're working with consumer SSDs.
Right?
And we've got this great technical article here that really gets into the nitty-gritty of it,
Yeah.
all the challenges, all the solutions. I
hmm
think this is going to be super useful for anyone out there who's running Proxmox with ZFS and, really wants to make sure they're getting the absolute most out of their setup. So let's just jump right in. The article really emphasizes that consumer SSDs, while they might seem like a good choice, they weren't really designed for the kind of heavy lifting that ZFS can throw at them.
Yeah.
What are the main things that make this combo, ZFS and consumer SSDs, a little bit tricky?
Well, the thing is, consumer SSDs, I mean, they're fast, right?
Oh,
They're
yeah.
affordable. They're everywhere.
Yeah.
But, when you start using them with ZFS, especially with all of its features, there's some things you got to be aware of.
Yeah.
You really got to understand what you're getting into.
Gotcha. So let's break it down.
Sure.
What are those key factors that we should be thinking about?
So one of the core things about ZFS is this thing called copy on write, COW.
Right, COW. I've heard of that.
So instead of just overwriting data like a normal file system,
Yeah.
ZFS creates a copy. So that way, even if the power goes out while you're writing, your data is still safe.
Ah, okay, I see. So that's good for data integrity, but how does that actually affect the wear and tear on an SSD?
Right. So think about it this way. You're editing a big video file. With a regular file system, the changes are just written over the old data.
Mm-hmm.
But with ZFS and COW, it makes a whole new copy of the changed parts.
Okay.
So that's way more write operations, right?
Yeah,
And that can be a problem for those consumer SSDs. They're just not built for that kind of heavy use.
that makes sense. And it's not just COW that's putting a strain on these drives.
Not at all.
ZFS also has all these other features like scrubbing and resilvering, which I imagine those add to the workload as well.
Oh, absolutely. Think of scrubbing like a background process, right?
Mm.
It's constantly checking your data, making sure everything's in order.
Okay.
Resilvering, that's when you replace a drive in your ZFS pool. It basically rebuilds the data on the new drive, to keep that redundancy.
Right, right.
And both of these things involve reading and writing huge amounts of data.
Mm.
That puts a ton of stress on your SSDs.
So we're seeing how all these great features of ZFS, they're fantastic for data integrity, but they can really push consumer SSDs to their limits. And the article then dives into the performance impacts of this. So what should our listeners be aware of? Like, how might this actually affect their experience when using Proxmox?
Okay, so one big thing is I/O delay.
I/O delay.
This is basically how long the system has to wait for the SSD to read or write data. And if your SSDs are struggling to keep up with ZFS, you're going to experience these delays. It might feel like things are running slow, especially if you're doing things like running virtual machines or, transcoding media.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. It's like when you're streaming a movie and it keeps buffering.
Exactly, yeah.
That's super frustrating.
Totally. And the article also talks about power loss protection. It's called PLP.
Oh, yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
big difference between consumer and enterprise SSDs.
Okay, so can you explain why that's so important for a server?
Yeah, so PLP, it basically uses capacitors to give the SSD enough power to finish writing data, even if the power goes out suddenly.
Oh.
Most consumer SSDs don't have that.
Right.
So if you lose power, you risk losing data. Enterprise SSDs, they usually have PLP built in.
So that's another layer of protection for your data,
Exactly.
which is super important, especially in a server environment like Proxmox, where you really need things to be reliable. And then there's the question of endurance, which the article also highlights as a potential issue. What should our listeners know about SSD endurance, particularly in the context of ZFS?
Okay, so SSD endurance, it's measured in TBW, which stands for terabytes written.
Okay.
Basically, it tells you how much data you can write to the drive before it starts to wear out.
Got it.
Now, enterprise SSDs, they're designed for heavy workloads. They have much higher TBW ratings than consumer SSDs.
Right.
ZFS, with all its read-write activity, it can wear down consumer SSDs much faster.
Right.
And that can lead to, the drive failing sooner than you'd like.
So it's not just about performance hiccups, it's also about the lifespan of the drives themselves.
Right.
Choosing the right SSD is clearly super important for a stable and reliable Proxmox setup when you're using ZFS. But what if someone's already gone ahead and set up their Proxmox system with consumer SSDs?
Yeah.
Should they be worried? Is there anything they can do to optimize their setup?
Well, there are definitely things you can do to mitigate some of these challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get better performance and you can make those consumer SSDs last longer in a Proxmox ZFS environment.
Okay, good. So let's dive into those optimization strategies. What are some practical things that our listeners can do to improve their setup?
Yeah, let's get into that.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges. Now let's get into those optimization strategies. What are some practical things that our listeners can do, to actually improve their setup if they're using consumer SSDs with ZFS?
All right. One of the easiest things you can do is really simple but effective, is to disable the A-time parameter in ZFS.
A time. What is that?
So A-time, that stands for access time. It basically keeps track of when a file was last accessed.
Okay.
Now, that can be useful sometimes, but in a ZFS environment, it creates a lot of extra write operations.
I see. So if I'm always accessing files on my Proxmox server, disabling a time could lighten the load on my SSDs.
Exactly. Think about like a web server. Files are constantly being accessed. Disabling a time there, it can really make a difference. You'll see better performance, and your SSDs will last longer.
Okay, so that's a great tip for anyone running web servers or anything like that on their Proxmox setup. What other optimization strategies can we talk about?
All right, another good one is to use a separate log device. It's called SLLog.
SLLog. Okay.
Basically, it's a dedicated SSD, a really fast one. And it handles all the synchronous write operations, so your main storage pool doesn't have to.
So instead of those writes going straight to the consumer SSDs in my ZFS pool, they're going to the super fast SLLog first.
Exactly. It takes a lot of the pressure off your consumer SSDs, and it can really boost performance, especially for tasks that involve a lot of writing.
Got it. So what should you look for when choosing an SSD for a SLLog? Are there any specific specs or features that are important?
Yeah. You want the fastest SSD you can get. NVMe is ideal.
NVMe, okay.
And since the SLLog is handling these critical write operations, you really want to make sure it has power loss protection.
Right, to protect against those sudden power outages.
Exactly. So that your data stays safe.
So high-speed NVMe SSD with PLP, that seems like the ideal combo for a slog. The article also mentions something about ZFS cache settings. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah. So if you've got plenty of RAM in your Proxmox system, you can increase the size of the ZFS ORC. That's the adaptive replacement cache.
Okay, the ERC.
Basically, it lets ZFS keep more of the frequently used data in RAM.
Right.
So it doesn't have to go back to the SSDs as often.
So it's like having a super fast cache right there in memory.
Exactly. It can really speed things up.
That sounds great. Are there any downsides to making the RC bigger?
Well, the main thing to watch out for is that it uses more system RAM.
Right, of course.
Make sure you have enough RAM to spare so other processes don't get slowed down.
Yeah, finding that balance is key.
Yeah.
Now, even with all these optimizations, it's still important to keep an eye on the health of those SSDs, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The article recommends using a tool called Scrutiny.
Scrutiny.
It's great for monitoring your SSDs.
So what kind of things does Scrutiny actually track, and what should we be looking out for as potential warning signs?
So Scrutiny gives you all sorts of information about your SSDs, things like temperature, wear level, and that TDW value we talked about earlier.
Right, the terabytes written.
If you keep an eye on these things, you can get a good sense of how your SSDs are doing and maybe catch any problems before they get serious. Like if you see the TBW getting close to the limit for your SSD, it might be time to start thinking about a replacement.
So Scrutiny is like having a dashboard for your SSDs.
Pretty much, yeah.
It gives you the information you need to stay on top of things. With all these optimization strategies, it sounds like you can actually get pretty good performance and lifespan out of consumer SSDs in a Proxmox ZFS setup.
Yeah, you definitely can.
But the article also brings up the idea of upgrading to enterprise-grade SSDs. When does that become a necessary step?
Well, it really depends on what you're using your Proxmox system for. I mean, if you're running mission-critical applications or dealing with really sensitive data, or if you just need the absolute best performance, then enterprise-grade SSDs are the way to go.
Okay.
They're just built differently. They're designed for heavy use. They've got features like power loss protection, and they have those much higher TBW ratings, so they're going to last a lot longer.
So for those power users, those people running really demanding workloads on Proxmox with ZFS, is it safe to say that enterprise-grade SSDs are really the best choice?
Yeah, I'd say so. For those use cases, they're definitely the way to go. They offer a level of reliability and performance that consumer SSDs just can't match.
Okay, so for those power users out there, the folks running these, really demanding systems on Proxmox with ZFS, it sounds like enterprise-grade SSDs, they're the gold standard.
Yeah, pretty much.
But what if someone's already using consumer SSDs and they want to make the switch?
Yeah.
What does that look like? Is that a painful process?
No, not at all. Actually, one of the great things about ZFS is that it's really flexible.
Okay.
So you can actually replace those consumer SSDs in a ZFS mirror. You can do it one at a time with enterprise-grade drives, and you don't lose any data.
Oh, wow.
And the system can stay up and running the whole time.
So you can gradually upgrade to enterprise SSDs without having to, like, rebuild everything from scratch.
Exactly. No downtime, no data loss.
That's awesome. That's really reassuring. But what about those folks who are kind of in the middle? You know, they need something better than a consumer SSD, but maybe they're not quite ready to jump to the top tier enterprise grade stuff.
Right. Well, the article mentions this interesting option. It's called mixed-use SSDs.
Mixed use. Okay.
Yeah, they're kind of a sweet spot. They give you a good balance of performance and durability, and they're usually a bit more affordable than the full-on enterprise drives.
So it's like a stepping stone. You get some of the benefits of enterprise SSDs without the sticker shock.
Yeah, exactly. It really comes down to choosing the right tool for the job, right?
Right.
'Cause, I mean, you wouldn't use a hammer to tighten a screw.
Definitely not.
Same thing with SSDs. You got to pick the one that fits your Proxmox ZFS setup, your workload, your budget.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. It's clear that understanding the ins and outs of SSDs and how they work with ZFS is just so important for getting the most out of your Proxmox system. What's the key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most important thing is to really understand the different types of SSDs out there.
Mm-hmm.
What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Especially when you're using them with ZFS. Consumer SSDs can work, especially if you use those optimizations we talked about.
Right.
But if you're running demanding workloads, mission-critical stuff, you really want to consider those enterprise-grade or mixed-use SSDs.
It's all about making smart choices, right? Knowing your needs and understanding the trade-offs.
Exactly.
We've covered a ton of information today, but this is really just the tip of the iceberg. What are some resources that you would recommend for our listeners? If they want to learn more, kind of dig deeper into this stuff.
Well, the Proxmox community forums are great. Lots of knowledgeable people there. You can learn a lot from other users' experiences.
Oh, yeah. Those forums are a gold mine.
And of course, there's the ZFS documentation. It's really comprehensive. You can find out all about the advanced features and how to really fine-tune things.
Excellent advice. And one final thought to leave our listeners with. While we focused on SSDs today, remember that your storage is just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Right.
The performance of your Proxmox system depends on a lot of things. Your CPU, your RAM, your network. So take a step back, look at the big picture, and don't be afraid to experiment. Find what works best for you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's all about continuous learning and optimization.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into ZFS and SSDs and Proxmox. We hope you found it helpful and informative. Until next time, happy Proxmoxing, everyone.